Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know those large language models? Those LLMs are everywhere now.
Oh, yeah, they're everywhere now.
Behind things like ChatGPT, search engines even.
Writing tools.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's kind of mind-blowing. So today we're going to be diving into some research that you sent over about whether they have, like, an ideological slant.
Fascinating stuff, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because these LLMs are becoming so important to the way we find and understand information almost.
Yeah. Almost like digital gatekeepers.
Gatekeepers, exactly.
Yeah.
It is a little scary.
It is a little scary.
And the research that you shared really digs into whether they might lean towards certain viewpoints.
Right.
And if so,
Yeah.
whether that reflects like the views of their creators.
It's like, is the AI, forming its own opinions?
Right.
Or is it just echoing the programmers,
Yeah.
It's a big question.
So how did they even figure that out? How did they go about figuring that out?
Well, instead of directly asking the LLMs for their opinions, which can be unreliable.
The researchers had these LLMs describe almost 4,500 prominent figures from recent history.
Okay, so instead of asking, like, what do you think about this person?
Right, exactly.
They said, describe this person.
Precisely.
Okay.
So they would say something like, tell me about Nelson Mandela. And then they would take that description that the AI wrote and have the AI analyze it for its moral stance.
Oh, so they were like, okay, based on what you just wrote,
Exactly.
do you think this person's good or bad?
That's a really cool approach.
That's really clever.
It's a really cool way to kind of get at that question of bias.
So they're judging their own writing in a way.
Exactly. And then to actually analyze those judgments, they use something called manifesto project tags, which categorizes political ideologies.
Okay.
So they could look and see if the LLMs were...
Were they leaning one way or the other?
Yeah, were they leaning towards certain, political leanings?
Interesting.
So yeah, it's a very, very clever approach.
And did they find that the language used to interact with the LLM impacted its responses?
They found that just switching the language used to interact with an LLM was almost like flipping a switch on its worldview.
Wow, really?
Yeah. For example, they looked at Jimmy Lai, a businessman and an activist from Hong Kong.
Okay.
And when they prompted the LLMs in English, he got significantly higher ratings than when prompted in Chinese.
Oh, wow. So just changing the language, like, flipped how they viewed him.
Yeah, and the opposite was true for figures aligned with China, like Lai Feng.
Okay.
Big thumbs up in Chinese, less enthusiastic in English.
Interesting.
So this is a big takeaway for listeners, right?
Yeah.
The language you use when you interact with these LLMs can impact the information or the perspective that you get back.
So it's not just a neutral response. You have to think about the language that you're using.
Exactly.
Wow, that's crazy.
And it gets even more interesting because it's not just about what language you use.
Oh.
Where the LLM was created also seems to play a role.
Okay.
So even when prompted in the same language, Western-made LLMs and non-Western LLMs show some pretty interesting differences in their judgments.
So it's like not just the words themselves, it's like where the AI was like raised.
That's a great way to put it.
Like its background.
Yeah. So for instance,
Right.
Western LLMs seem to really like liberal democratic values, social justice, environmentalism.
Okay, yeah, so classic Western ideals.
Exactly.
Okay, what about non-Western LLMs? Did they lean in a different direction?
They did. They tended to favor things like centralized economic governance and national stability.
Interesting. Okay, so it really is like they're mirroring the cultures that they come from.
It is. And that kind of leads to some pretty big questions. You know, like, are we unintentionally creating AIs that mirror our own biases? And what does that mean for the future of information?
Yeah, that is something to think about for sure.
Lots to think about.
Wow, I suddenly feel like I need to be a lot more aware of the power of these things.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this has been a lot to think about already, but it gets even more nuanced. Because even within the West, there's a spectrum of viewpoints that emerge among the different LLMs.
Yeah, it's not like a monolith.
So not all Western AIs are like spitting out the same perspective.
No, exactly. They each have their own little quirks and nuances.
Okay, well, I'm going to need to take a breath and then we'll dive into that. Okay, I think I've caught my breath here. So you're saying that even Western-made LLMs aren't all ideologically identical.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it makes you think about, like, the future of information and how all these different viewpoints from AI could shape it, you know?
Yeah, like, are we headed towards some kind of AI information utopia, or is it going to be like a dystopian echo chamber?
Well, those are the million-dollar questions, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think we have all the answers just yet, but this research really highlights, the complexities.
Right. So less about predicting the future, more about being aware of the potential pitfalls.
Yeah, exactly. As we navigate this whole new world of AI.
Right. Okay. So less crystal ball, more like cautionary tale.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get back to those differences you were talking about among the Western LLMs.
Sure.
You mentioned that Google's Gemini was like really into all those progressive values.
Yeah.
What about other LLMs like ChatGPT? Where do they fit in?
Well, OpenAI's LLMs like ChatGPT had some interesting quirks.
Okay.
For one, they weren't as focused on human rights as some of the other Western models.
Really? That's kind of surprising. I would think that an AI that was created in a democratic society would be all about individual freedoms and stuff.
Yeah, you would think so, right?
Yeah.
But they seem a bit more pragmatic,
Okay.
shall we say. They also showed a higher tolerance for corruption compared to the other Western models.
So a little less idealistic, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that, we're not saying that these LLMs are consciously endorsing these viewpoints.
Right.
It's more about these subtle patterns that emerge in their responses.
Yeah, like the ideology that's kind of woven into the code.
Precisely. And it's worth noting that these are just snapshots of these LLMs at a particular point in time, right?
Right.
They're constantly learning and evolving, so these leanings could shift, as they're exposed to more data.
Yeah, so it's not like a static thing. It's like a moving target.
It is a moving target.
Okay. Even more reason to like stay informed and keep our critical thinking skills sharp.
Absolutely. And speaking of different perspectives, there was another Western LLM that stood out. Mistral.
Mistral.
Yeah, developed in France.
Ooh la la, a French AI.
That's right.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Well, Mistral was interesting because it really preferred state-oriented and cultural values.
So like collective good, national identity, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Which makes sense given, the French political landscape.
It does, yeah. They also tended to give higher ratings to figures who supported China.
Oh, interesting.
And here's a twist. They weren't as keen on the European Union.
Wait a minute. A French AI that's not a huge fan of the EU?
I know, right? A little unexpected.
That is very unexpected.
But it just goes to show that even within a region like Western Europe, there's this spectrum of opinions, and they can find their way into these AIs that we create.
Yeah, it's fascinating how these AIs seem to be absorbing these values, even if it's not explicitly programmed.
It's like this cultural osmosis,
Yeah.
And that kind of raises a question. When we're interacting with an LLM, whether it's a chatbot or a search engine, how do we make sure we're not just, blindly accepting what it tells us? How do we make sure we're not getting trapped in an AI echo chamber?
Yeah, that's a great question. It sounds like we need to kind of shift how we think about these AIs.
Yeah, we do. First, we need to accept that no source of information is perfectly neutral.
Okay.
Especially LLMs, right? I mean, they're products of their creators
and
the data that they're trained on. So they're going to reflect those influences inevitably.
So step one, acknowledge that the AI isn't like some all-knowing objective oracle or something.
Exactly. And then we need to be aware of these potential sources of bias, right? We talked about language, region of origin, the company behind the LLM. These are all things to keep in mind.
Like doing a background check on the AI before we accept what it tells us?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And then think about the types of questions that you're asking and how those questions might be interpreted by the LLM.
Oh, right. Like if I'm asking leading questions,
exactly,
I'm probably going to get leading answers.
Yeah, it's like talking to a person.
Right.
Right.
It's the same principle.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, engage those critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
Think about the information that you're getting from the LLM. Does it align with your existing knowledge? Does it make sense? Are there other perspectives that are being overlooked?
So don't just like passively absorb information. Be an active participant in the conversation, even if it's with an AI.
Exactly. Don't let the AI do all the thinking.
Right.
Challenge it, question it, and most importantly, seek out diverse perspectives.
Okay.
To get that well-rounded view.
So the future of information is going to be less about finding the right answer and more about navigating a landscape of diverse perspectives, a lot of them shaped by AIs.
I think that's a really great way to put it. And, in a way that's not so different from the world we already live in.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, we're constantly bombarded with different viewpoints and opinions, and it's up to us to filter through that information and form our own opinions.
I guess the difference now is that we have AI adding its voice to the mix, which just makes things even more complex and more interesting.
It really does, and it highlights why critical thinking is more important now than ever before.
Okay.
We can't just take information at face value. whether it comes from an AI, a news article, even a conversation with a friend.
So true.
You really got to think about it.
Well, I'm feeling energized and overwhelmed at the same time.
That's understandable. It's a lot to take in.
It really is.
But the important thing is that we're having these conversations and we're becoming aware of the challenges and the opportunities that LLMs present.
Right, because knowledge is power. And in the age of AI, understanding how these systems think and how they might be shaping our world is absolutely crucial.
Couldn't agree more.
But before we go any further, I think we need to look at the other side of the coin here.
Okay.
You know, we've been focusing on Western LLMs.
Right.
What about those that were developed in other parts of the world?
Yeah.
Are they just mirror images of their Western counterparts, ideologically speaking?
That's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is a little bit more complicated than a simple yes or no.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about those regional differences earlier?
Yeah, vaguely.
Those really come into play when we compare Western and non-Western LLMs.
Okay, can you remind me about some of those key differences? My brain is still catching up.
Yeah, sure. So Western LLMs, we said they were generally more into those liberal democratic values, social justice, environmentalism.
Right, all the good stuff.
All the good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the non-Western LLMs were more about economic control and stability.
Okay.
And these differences were apparent even when both sets of LLMs were prompted in English.
Okay.
It's not just about the language itself.
Yeah.
It goes deeper than that. It's about the underlying data sets,
Yeah.
the design choices that go into creating these AIs.
So they're kind of absorbing those values of their creators and the cultures they're embedded in, even if it's not explicitly programmed.
That's exactly it.
Wow. Okay. So much to think about.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm using an LLM, you know, whether it's a chatbot, a search engine, even a writing tool.
Right.
What are some practical tips for being a more discerning user? How do I avoid getting sucked into that AI echo chamber?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's one that we should all be asking ourselves. I think it comes down to a few key things.
All right, lay it on me. I'm ready for a crash course in navigating the world of AI information.
So much to consider. Right. Like
Yep.
we were saying, it all starts with acknowledging that no information source is perfectly neutral.
Right, like even these fancy AI.
Fancy AS, yeah.
Okay, so assuming the AI is giving us like the ultimate objective truth.
Nope. Got to be a little skeptical.
Right.
And remember all those factors we talked about?
Yeah.
Language, where the LLM was the company behind it.
Yeah.
Those can all play a role.
So it's like almost a healthy skepticism towards all information now.
I think so. Yeah, especially in this age of AI, you got to be careful.
So true.
And think about the questions you're asking, too.
Oh, yeah.
How those might be interpreted by the LLM.
Right. Like leading questions get you leading answers.
Exactly like talking to a person, really.
It's the same.
Same principle.
Okay, so be aware. Ask good questions.
Yes. And don't forget that most important tool,
Which is?
critical thinking.
Yes. Can't forget that.
Think about the info you're getting. Does it line up with what you already know? Does it make sense? Are there other angles you should be thinking about?
Right, so we can't just passively absorb everything anymore.
Yeah.
We got to be active, really think about what we're being told.
Exactly. And that's super important with these LLMs. They're powerful tools,
Yeah.
but they're not perfect.
Yeah.
Got to challenge them, question them, seek out different viewpoints to get the full picture.
So the future of information isn't about finding the right answer. It's about navigating all these different perspectives.
Yeah. And a lot of them are going to be shaped by AI.
Which is kind of mind-blowing.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's not totally new, right? We've always had to sift through different opinions and
Gotta
ideals.
figure out what we believe.
Exactly. But now AI is adding its voice to the mix.
Which is cool,
It is cool.
but also a little daunting.
Definitely makes things more complex.
So critical thinking is more important than ever.
More important than ever, can't just take things at face value anymore, whether it's from an AI or a news article or even a conversation with a friend.
So true.
You really got to think for yourself.
Well, this has been a lot.
It has.
Feeling a bit overwhelmed, but also excited.
I get it. It's a lot to take in. But the important thing is we're having these conversations. We're becoming aware of the challenges and the opportunities these LLMs are bringing.
Because knowledge is power, especially in the age of AI.
Absolutely.
We got to understand how these systems work, how they're shaping our world.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of LLMs and their potential ideological leanings.
It has.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. And until next time, keep those minds curious and those critical thinking skills sharp.